Welcome, everybody. My name is Heather Rangel, and I'm here from Deloitte in the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I'm Ron Storn, also from the Silicon Valley. I'm here with Zume, the Chief People Officer. You see our pictures in the background there, and I look obviously different. So.
And me. I hate when that picture goes up because I feel like people are like, girl, you do not look like that, okay? Brush your hair.
Yeah. And I just turned 50 recently, so I want to do something different. So a beard, and here I am. So it's the trend. So I've been at Zume for about 2 years, and it's Zume, not the communications company. And so what Zume does, kind of like books is to Amazon, we were pizza, where we were first-party pizza, where we made robotic pizza, and got a lot of logistics and prediction in the company in order to optimize delivery. And so what we expanded from that is now to the platform, where we're actually a mid-mile solution for a lot of restaurants, convenience stores, where we can predict who's going to buy what, when, and where. And we have this truck where you can actually cook live food, or you can freeze it or keep it in a refrigerator. And then like a DoorDash or Uber Eats can come up and get 3 orders and deliver it in a more efficient time manner. So it optimizes the whole food supply chain and the economics there. And before that, I was at Lyft for 4.5 years, where I was a chief people officer there and grew it from 80 to 3,000 employees, not including the driver. So a lot of it we'll talk about is some of the craziness that was there as well too. And so I always like to start, how many people took a ride sharing service to get here to the conference? How many were Lyft? Half and half. Or maybe a little bit less than half, but I won't leave.
Does it bother you that the casinos say Uber/rideshare?
It does. Even though I'm not at Lyft, I'm still always, that's where my heart is. But different cities have different types of partnerships. So, but as long as we use ride sharing, I'm happy about that.
There you go. So I've been a management consultant in the Valley. How many of you have worked with consultants before? Okay, so maybe I'll perpetuate some stereotypes today. Maybe I'll bust some, we'll see. But that's how I came across Ron. I spent my whole career in the Valley. I've been there a little more than 20 years and mainly have been focused on startups and hypergrowth startups. So now I lead the relationship for Deloitte on one of the bigger kind of hypergrowth companies that have sort of made it. We good?
Okay, sorry.
Don't go.
We have to just move forward a little bit.
Good. Okay, anyway, that's where I came across Ron, because I tend to help companies when they finally admit that they might want a little help. Usually it's secret when they're startups. They're like, don't tell anyone, but we need a consultant to help us with this little piece. And that's when I sort of met Ron, and we've been working together ever since. So between the two of us, we should have some pretty good perspective for you on what we've seen and what we've seen work and what we've seen not work in terms of managing hypergrowth, managing culture and org development through hypergrowth.
I remember when we met, I think the second meeting, we were on the whiteboard designing the whole people org and how that would support the growth of Lyft. So yeah, there's a lot of great experiences that we have together.
And now you just perpetuated the myth, So along those lines, when Ron asked me to do this with him, he wanted to be a bit flexible about how we were going to address the content, but I couldn't help myself, and I put a spreadsheet together and created a framework for the discussion. So this is going to be the framework, okay? We're going to take that S curve of hypergrowth, and we're going to look at that steepest part, and kind of broke that down into analogy of 3 phases, okay? Because I know all hypergrowth doesn't have to mean pre-IPO and on to an IPO, but we're just going to kind of use that as a guidepost for how we examine this. So we'll look at the phase that we're calling seed swagger, when you just kind of got flush with money and very culture-based and starting to build the machine. And then we'll go to the next phase that we're calling pre-IPO anxiety, because the whole phase is like sort of marked by anxiety. So we'll talk through what we see there. And then we'll go to that quote-unquote maturity stage, which I would argue is more like adolescence than maturity. So, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that as a great metaphor for how we can manage through things. So that's the way we're going to do this, and it'll be a little bit like a fireside where I kind of go through each phase, and Ron gives his thoughts, and then I'll kind of chime in.
And we want it to be interactive too. So if there's anything that resonates with you or things top of mind, feel free to ask the questions, and we'll try to do that real time.
So one interesting thing, I had an intern this summer pull together everything she could on this topic, just because I had an intern and I needed to keep her busy, and just to make sure we didn't have our bias. We know we're in our kind of Silicon Valley bubble, and the companies that we've worked with have all gone through this sort of pre-IPO thing. So overwhelmingly, all the research from everything you could pull on this is talent culture, talent culture, talent culture. It's all about that through hypergrowth. And I know you know that firsthand, being in the chief talent officer role. Is that what you have experienced too?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, in the early days of Lyft, Lyft and Uber were strong rivals, right? And what really separated us was the culture and how we treated people. And I remember when we had our values, when I first got there, it was 80 people, and it was very focused on drivers. And so everything was about the drivers, which is very important, but that's only one piece of it. So we kind of remodeled it around all the key stakeholders. So we wanted to get values that would align to employees, to candidates, to drivers, to our customers. And that really kind of started the tipping point of how we, form the company, how the thought process worked. Because if you got values that you actually would reinforce and learn from, it would be the thought process and how you collaborate and how you interact with people. So that was very important to do in the early stages, because as you scale a company, it's harder to change when you're 1,000 people or 2,000 people. You want to set that from the beginning. And obviously it's going to be iterative, and the meanings behind the values might change, or you might even switch out values, but it's important to start early on in order to really scale that.
The other big insight that came out of the research for me was, when we look at hypergrowth, we're looking at something that, first of all, is not it's not necessarily expected. Sometimes you find yourself in it before you realize that you're there, and then so you're trying to manage this train while it's already moving kind of too fast. The other thing is, org development in and of itself is supposed to be a mechanism to promote efficiency and help you manage during growth. And when you're in hypergrowth, you're in an unpredictable situation. So it's almost like this oxymoron. And I think one thing that we found in working together especially is it's these micro moves. All goes along with being a responsive organization and being agile, but it's all you can manage to do are micro moves through this because of the unpredictability. So let's get into the first phase. So we're in our seed swagger phase. Let's talk about some cultural kind of markers that we see happening in this phase.
Yep. So like I mentioned about the value systems that we had. So a lot of companies talk about values but don't reinforce them. So we at Lyft had company meetings every 2 weeks where we would nominate someone who went above and beyond one of those values, and you would recognize them and give them gift cards. So what it does, it reinforces how important it is to act a certain way. So those are some traditions that are starting to be built there. Also, as Heather was saying, you have to start bringing in talent. And at Lyft, we knew we were starting to really grow. We had our series round from Andreessen, and we were starting to take off and really wanted to, in this space, you have to go fast, right? And so part of the issues is that no one knew how to interview. So there's really no structure around interviewing. And so we needed to develop a tradition around how to assess the full candidate. If I may, one of the first things that people wanted to hire people or was a marker to say no to someone is that if they were not a power Lyft user. And in the early days, Lyft was only in 6 cities. So a lot of people didn't even know what Lyft was. So what I was saying is, yes, you can get someone to learn to love a product, but if you don't have that product in mass market yet, it's fine if they're not a power user, but you want someone who's creative and disruptive. So you want to get a mindset that people want to help build and grow things. So that was something key that was a problem in the beginning that people should look at during those things, so you can start setting the groundwork of how you develop an organization.
And along comes with those, the initial value system comes those traditions that start to get baked and developed at that early stage. And being a consultant who's walked into, countless number of companies, they all have their thing or their things that they need to do. And being really mindful about which traditions start to get baked, because you can't get rid of them. And eventually, and we'll talk about this later, people are going to start to demonize you for them if they have the slightest bit of negativity to them, or if employees start to get irritated by them. So being very mindful of the traditions get baked. Also from a sustainability standpoint, I never served Airbnb, so I'm not talking out of school here, but I remember Airbnb used to offer tons of credit to their employees for Airbnb stays. And it was like so obviously unsustainable, but it was like this major factor. People were getting recruited and hired because they loved to travel. That was one of their value drivers, was like people who love to travel and like go on adventures. And here was this great benefit that sort of went along with that. And it was going to be unsustainable as they grew, especially during hypergrowth, to keep doing that. So any experience with unfortunate traditions that got baked early on?
Yeah, well, I mean, like you're saying with Airbnb, Lyft, you had Lyft credits, right? And, Uber had their credits as well, too. And we had to compete with them because some employees were saying, well, Uber gets more credits than Lyft. And so the one key to any of these traditions is what Heather's saying, it has to be scalable. And once you roll out a tradition or a program, it's very, very difficult to take it back. Like food programs, too. Like in the beginning, we were very mindful where we had lunches, we didn't have breakfast, and we didn't have dinners. Eventually, we succumbed and brought some of those in. But again, you have to be very thoughtful. I could remember even in the early days, once you started getting like avocados and berries and our CFO wanted to ration those back a little bit, there was a revolt. And it's the entitlement, right? So you just have to be very smart and strategic. Another tradition is that the founders would always want to interview every candidate, at least for 5 minutes, to make sure that it was a value alignment. And okay, that's fine when you're small, but eventually you have to scale that. So we can talk about how that changes as the company grows.
Well, let's stay on that founders piece, because that was another point I want to make sure we bring up. There's also at that stage, I've seen so often, I still see it, these founder loyalists that get brought on. The founders need to surround themselves by people they trust, and then they have these people that sort of don't have the right skills really to do anything but just like promote culture and provide safety to the founders. And I often get called in to like, what are we going to do with this person who like we can't get rid of, and the founders love her or him, but they don't really have the right job, and they're actually toxic. So what do we do about the founder loyalists?
Yeah, that's difficult in every company I've been in. You have the early day folks who are so, they were there before they were big, right? And it's like family when you're like 20, 30 people. But, some people can scale with the company, others cannot. Sometimes what you want to do, especially if they're so key to the founders, you want to try to take them into a different role. Part of the problems you have in seed stage types of companies is you overinflate titles. So someone might be a VP, but really they're a manager. And so as a company scales, you have to have some tough conversations. Some of them can be good. If your value systems are important and your value systems are reinforced all the time, you can work your way through it. I can give you one example where the initial CTO at the company, he was never around a bigger company before, but when we became 100 people, he probably wasn't the best CTO. So we had a conversation with him and kind of moved him into a VP of engineering role. And as a VP of engineering, he was fine. His skill set was he was a great manager. He could lead people, but from a technical standpoint and a scaling standpoint, doesn't have a lot of experience. So at another juncture, about 200 people, we went to him again and talked about, hey, you're very valuable to the company. We really like you. We still want to invest in you, but we have to do what's best for the company. And we said we want you to be an engineering director. So have a very smaller scope than you have now. Took a few days, but we talked through it with him, and he's still at Lyft today, which is probably about 8 years, and thriving in that role. So it's playing to people's strength, even if they're early days. But then there's a lot of others where it didn't go as well, too.
Yeah. I think we worked on that.
Yeah.
Okay, one other point I want to touch on this. Do we have a question?
Just a request to talk about the org design pieces as well.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going to. Well, kind of on this one. Let's see if this meets your needs. Otherwise, we can dig into some more specific questions. One thing that I see as a great mitigation sort of activity, baking in standardized processes as early as possible, including at this phase. So that goes for business processes like a monthly business review or whatever it is that you need to kind of stay connected on how you're analyzing your business. And that means all functions, including HR and talent, but also decision-making principles, because that's the one that breaks most quickly. And so from an org development standpoint, if you can get, again, like we can't design the org that's going to even possibly last to the next phase or the phase beyond that, but we can design some basic design principles and decision-making principles that could outlast all of the micro changes that need to happen along the way. So another thing on that example, like your ERP systems, perfect example. Almost every startup I've worked with has really failed on this number. Systems and technologies start to proliferate because you have this entrepreneurial mindset and empowered decision-making mindset. The number one, best thing you could do is get your data. Keep your data centralized from the beginning, because that is the thing that later down the line, when org starts to change 5 times over, growth is happening. If you have consistent data, that's the number one thing that's going to empower your employees to make the right decisions that can stay in alignment with your decision-making principles that you set up. So I know that was a long kind of trail to follow, but that is the number one advice that I think I would give if I walked into a startup today. And I just did 2 weeks ago. I was helping them with a similar issue. We have these people who don't belong here and don't need them anymore, number one. Number two, we have founders with chaotic objectives, and we don't know how to prioritize them. So come help us prioritize them. The first thing we did was got their workday straight. It sounds like the most unsexy, terrible thing that anyone would want to do, but we had to get their data in one place before we could even help them start to make decisions.
No, I mean, spot on. I mean, I learned a lot of lessons at Lyft that I changed at Zume. I mean, early on, everyone's looking to hire the best athletes for the most part. Smart people who value the culture, who are connected to the mission and vision, and they want to have impact in their role. So trying to develop an org structure around that, domain expertise isn't the thing that people are looking for. It's more about, talent and drive. And so in the early stages, the org design was very fluid. There really wasn't an org design. It was really just, get smart people to work on hard problems and then figure it out. But as you scale a company, that's not going to work. One of the things I learned as well from a systems standpoint and data standpoint, you should always have the mindset that you're going to scale. You're going to scale big. Now, a company is never going to fail if you put in a system that's maybe a little bit more advanced than the stage you're at. You want to be success. You want to set up yourself for a foundation that's scalable and a repeatable process that can handle larger workforces. So at Lyft, I didn't do that. So I inherited some rudimentary systems from a ATS standpoint and HRIS system standpoint, and we did a good job in terms of trying to find new technology that was more innovative. Like, we were the second company to ever use Lever as our ATS, so that actually was something that worked. But we also were one of the first companies that put in Oracle HCM first, and that was a disaster. So there's things that you have to learn, and you want to just think about getting the right system that will scale 5,000, 10,000 people. Doesn't mean you're going to get there, but you have to have that mindset and think about it. And the ROI on that will be much better, because if you have to change the costs of putting a system in, taking it out, putting something else in is very difficult, and it's hard on everyone within the organization.
Mm-hmm. And we'll continue to talk about the org dev through the other phases here. I think it becomes much more important as we get into these next phases. So it was a good segue into the anxiety phase, okay? This is when consultants really do get called in. By the way, a little plug for consultants at the seed stage, right? You think you shouldn't call consultants because they're super expensive and you don't have any money and you don't want outside opinion. Many consultants will come volunteer their time and work on, pre kind of startup environments because of the interest in the issue. So I think don't underestimate bringing in outside help, even if you think there's not money to be made for somebody. A lot of people do that. But let's go to the anxiety phase, okay? So this is when people start anxiously clinging to those traditions, because a lot of outside talent coming in, and the OG people want to hang on to preserve the culture. So what sort of problems do we see arise there?
Yeah, because a lot of times people in the early days actually get promoted and move roles very fluidly and quickly. And as you start scaling an organization, you need to stay in that role a little bit longer. You get more experts in there. It's not just generalists. So the OG folks have a hard time in a lot of the places. So when you have to have a balance of promoting within and hiring from the outside. So you have to be very measured. And there are some people that are culture carriers. So you have to make sure that you talk through some of these pivot points with all the key employees in the company. So this is when you start having those tough conversations. And with the founders, I remember at Lyft, there were a few people that were not scaling. And the worst thing you could do when you're bringing in top talent, especially new talent, is if you cater to early day people who are obviously not performing well, that's going to kill your culture. So on the one hand, you want someone to continue to grow and have opportunities, but if you don't manage out poor performers, no matter what tenure they're in, that's going to kill your culture. So finally it got through that we had to do that, and it's still it's a very nuanced approach because you never know exactly how the org is going to be affected. It might affect one way in the engineering org, another way in the ops org, and so that's very key to what we're trying to do in this type of phase. And when everyone thinks about hyper growth, it's all about hire, but it's also important to get rid of some of the people that don't fit what you're trying to do as an organization. So I say hire, cut, right? And it's not that you do massive layoffs. You just really have to be strategic and mindful that you want to have people who are aligned from a value standpoint who can really scale with the company in all the areas that you need. And it's not easy to do that. The tradition about everyone being interviewed by the founder, at this stage, that's just not scalable. So if you're hiring leaders, you have to make sure that the values alignment is more important than the technical skills, because that values alignment is going to allow you to grow not only within your office, but from distributed offices, or if you have a remote workforce. So you have to trust your leaders to hold the standard for hiring within their organizations. So it's difficult, but it's important to do.
I think that I totally agree. We didn't even plan that, but I completely agree. That's the most important thing. Hire, cut is a great little phrase to remember. That's the biggest thing that I see later on. Is the people that you didn't cut, they cause the worst problems later, and then we have big projects to deal with that. The other thing I'd say, from an org design standpoint, you're now at this point where cross-functional interdependencies have arisen. However, they're not addressed yet. You're not working together at a systems level usually in this phase, but you absolutely need to be. But this kind of entrepreneurial, go get it done, solve your own problems, we're still there in this anxious phase, especially as we lead up to IPO. If you're lucky, you have a little bit of cross-functional sort of attention being paid. I would say let that go. Like let that happen and clean that up as soon as you can. If you try to solve for the systems level at this stage, when you're trying to keep the lights on the train as it's like moving 100 miles an hour down the track, it's almost impossible, having tried this with so many companies, to make a systemic change in this phase. So embrace the discomfort and the chaos, and make a note of what you need to change after, once you get to this phase. And then the way to kind of mitigate there too is figuring out what your core competitive advantage as a business is, right? And obviously, hopefully the founders and CEOs are communicating this to you. And then figure out which pieces of each of the functions that you're trying to solve for directly impact that core competitive advantage. Solve for those. And then let everything else be a little chaotic and anxiety-producing for a little while. And the other thing I'd point out, Ron knows I'm the most quintessentially happily single person you'll ever meet. I love being single. Do not fall in love in this stage. And I don't mean with people, I mean with anything that you're designing, any org structure, any role, any decision-making tree. Do not fall in love, because this is changing. And we're just trying to get through day to day at this phase.
No, it's spot on. I mean, both in Zume and in Lyft. I mean, in marketplace companies, it's what's centralized and what's decentralized, right? And so like at Lyft, when we started building out in each city, do you have a GM there? What are they responsible for? Are they responsible for the P&L of that business? Or you have a centralized marketing function that works with some of the people in the local city? So you have to think about a hyper-local model or a decentralized model. And we went back and forth a number of times at Lyft until we figured out what was best for us. Same thing at Zume. We have a lot of different business units. We have a pizza business. We have a packaging business now. We also have like a predictive, we call it forward, and then there's going to be other culinary things. And so you don't want to have duplicity in each of the orgs where you have like data scientists coming up in every organization, or you have an analyst in every organization. You have to be very thoughtful on what the org structure is. Don't get married to it, because it's going to evolve over time, but you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, because the worst thing that can happen when you have a cross-functional business that's dependent on each other and people aren't aligned, that's a disaster. So you have to get alignment, and it starts at the top, and you have to be very transparent and communicative, because if the people at the top aren't aligned, then everyone in their own org is not going to be aligned. So someone in product might be doing this product roadmap but has no alignment to what's happening in the ops world, and then there's a big disconnect at the midpoint and endpoint of a project. So it's very, very critical to do do that. And org design is very important there. And then you have to have your people organization aligned to that. So, for the GM model, for like a business partner model, what I did was have each geography, West, Midwest, and East, had a regional GM. So I had a business partner that was aligned to each of those GMs that would cover that territory, because you wanted to make sure that you couldn't have someone in every location, but you needed to have a touch point to see what was going on there, and how a business partner has to be core to what's happening in the business. It's not an execution arm. You have to lead with the business, and you want to remove obstacles so that people can be productive and optimize their work. So it's important that you get alignment at the leadership level with your business partner.
Mm-hmm. That's a good segue into our next phase, and I think, really starting to track what are those things you need to circle back on the second you can come up for air and kind of come back and put some attention to. And I read in part of the research, there was a good metaphor of a fractal. A fractal breaks off a piece and it's always an exact replica of itself. And if you look at it like a tree blossoming, each little node that starts to blossom has its own little CEO and team, and the node looks just exactly like the other node. If you take a little landscape check at this transition into this next phase, so you're coming up for air, and you make a tree of where all these investments and sort of org developments have been made, and you have this really off-balance tree, you got to fix the other side of it. So everything, your sales team needs to be balanced by your ops team. And so on. So to make sure that the tree that you're developing is a balanced tree, and you'll definitely come up for air and take a peek and see where you're off balance. So I think as we move into that next phase, and the metaphor that I gave you around adolescence versus maturity, as I said, I didn't mean that as a criticism. How many have teenager children? Okay, so when you've all been teenagers yourself. You don't like to be told what to do, right? And great parenting comes when you're given advice and design principles, and then you get to make the decision of what to do. And as soon as we try to tell a teenager what to do and back them into the corner, they rebel. And as a consultant dealing with companies in this stage, this is a lot what happens. You can see the train coming down the tracks, and you know what's about to happen because you just dealt with 20 other companies before, but you can't say like, oh, stop, this train's coming and here's what you need to do, because we just don't have the cultural elements and the org design in place to be able to manage that. So it comes around tiny little injections of sort of systemic wisdom that you all have because you're all experienced professionals, but you're managing large stakeholder groups around you. So tiny little injections of wisdom of how the system could be improved are going to help you when you look at that tree and it's off balance and you're trying to put it back together again. So keeping track of the little bits of insight that you can and sharing those with the relevant stakeholders when you can. I think that's a great technique.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when you get into this phase post IPO, I mean, the scrutiny is on you, and a lot of companies tend to lose their entrepreneurial spirit. And in the first two phases, everyone is trying to be creative and grow, and even within each org, there's an element that you have to try something new. You should not lose that after you go public. Yes, there's more of a balance about making sure you hit your numbers, but you also have to keep improving and getting better. Otherwise, your competition is going to catch up, or there's going to be a startup that's going to put you out of business down the road. So there's a fine line of encouraging that entrepreneurial spirit, but you also want to have org design that's going to be stressful, that piece that you're working on is going to meet all the needs of the company. So when you think about org design, I talked about scalable and repeatable. You have to have something where your operations org can support the growth you're going to have if you're going international, or if you're expanding the types of operations that you have. Like for instance, at Zume, we're in our packaging business. We're becoming a manufacturing company as well. Before, we were a very predictive and logistics company. Now we're manufacturing. So we're not public yet, but we're starting to see what that's going to look like. So you have to get ahead of it and make sure that you have the right org structure that supports that.
Let's talk about communications a little bit and your experiences there, because we mentioned these traditions start to get challenged, your core values start to get challenged. We look at Google's Don't Be Evil. That came back to bite them when they put up a censored version of Google in China. We look at Facebook, Move Fast and Break Things. That came back to bite them when they broke democracy in some people's perspectives. I love Facebook. So I'm not saying that, I'm just saying what perception. I talked to somebody recently who was in a fast growth startup, and I asked him, what was the most difficult thing for you as an employee? And he said, we used to know everything. The founders would tell us exactly what was going on. We knew every person, we knew where we were headed, and then being not in the know anymore was so painful. And until he relieved himself of like, I get to know everything, he was totally ineffective in his job. Now we can all hope that our employees will get to the stage of enlightenment that he did, but many don't. So how do you effectively handle moving from we tell you everything, Friday ask us anything, to like, oh my God, they're leaking it to Twitter, like live tweeting it as we're talking?
Yeah, no, that's very challenging. At Lyft too, especially with the competition with Uber, we were very careful on what we told all the employees because you didn't want to get that leaked out to the press or what have you. So what we ended up doing there is if we knew some story was going to hit, we would tell the employees a minute or 2 minutes before. So it felt like they were included in the process before hearing it from the outside. But we had a number of situations where things were leaked. When I was at Facebook, same thing. A lot of things were leaked, and Mark was very adamant about not having, keeping a very tight lip on things. So it's a fine balance. Usually when there's things about fundraising or things about, M&A activity, usually that is not discussed because some of those things you just get employees fired up one way or the other, and most of the times those things don't even happen anyway. So you try to tell employees real time, what's happening in terms of clients that we're winning or late stages on where we are in these opportunities. But from a fundraising standpoint and big type of other activities, it's very hard to you have to keep that within a closed group. As far as communication, when you get distributed offices and so forth, Zoom communications or some type of integration system where you can video in is so critical to the organization. Also, we use Slack, and at Lyft, we use Facebook at work. So there's a lot of different communication tools where you can talk about social events. You can talk about issues that maybe don't rise to the level where you talk about at a company meeting, but people still are in the know. The biggest thing is keeping people in the know, and you never want to have people outside of HQ feel like it's HQ versus them. They all have to be a part of the company because so there's little things that we would do. We would rotate our all hands meetings, so we would hold it in different offices, so it's not only in San Francisco where HQ was. We also have different scenarios where you usually take leaders to open new offices so you can keep that culture going and that you could really grow it in a way that the values are consistent across the whole company. Obviously, every location is going to be a little bit more unique, but you want to have that consistency. So those are some of the things that you do at this stage.
Circling back to decision making, now we talked early on of baking in those decision making principles as much as possible. So how is that going to play out so that it's working effectively at this stage? It comes from two things. It's going to sound so cliche to you guys who are at the responsive conference and know what responsive organizations look like, but it comes down to empowerment, which really empowerment comes from trust. And how can employees be empowered if they don't have the data that they need to make decisions? So that goes back to putting those systems together from the beginning. So I think it comes down to empowerment that you've enabled by giving them the data that they need and allowing them to make decisions as close to the front line as possible. And the second thing that it comes down to is this no fear of failure that, again, we had your big party about it last night, but I see examples of this every day where now we're in this phase, we have more outsiders than legacy people. Most of the outsiders that are brought in are like mature executives, or they've worked for traditional companies or even more traditional fast growth companies that have more matured fast growth companies, and they're coming in with like what works at these bigger companies. They tend to be used to being crucified when a mistake happens. And it is the death of effective decision making and problem solving. I just worked with a company the other week where somebody was supposed to get paid $4,000. They got paid $4 million for a bonus by accident. And it's not shocking, you guys. I have seen more countries not getting paid. I've seen people getting paid in multiple countries, people getting paid these outlandish, crazy amounts by accident. It happens all the time. But this finance leader was so scared of being crucified because that's what she was used to, that she then, projected all of that negative energy onto her whole team and was just like, what happened? We got to figure it out. Like, this is terrible. Instead of like, wow, that was a mistake, sucks, happens every company. What can we learn? Because a bunch of things broke there, and how can we learn from this? And the companies that can really have executives and leaders with that statement of empowerment of like, you're not about to be crucified, you're about to help us learn, are the ones that succeed during hypergrowth. And I say that with distinct examples of the most effective companies that have managed positivity and high margins during hypergrowth.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I can tell stories as well too. I mean, there was a couple of stories that, in the early days when you give equity off of basis points, instead of giving equity that was 0.01, they gave 0.1. So all these people got a lot more equity than they should have gotten. And at that point, we just let it go. We just kept how the employees leave that equity there. And that person wasn't fired. They made an honest mistake. And if they make another mistake like that, then there's more repercussions. But you want to empower people. You want people to grow and develop. That's one avenue. Then there was another situation where we had, Uber and Lyft do all these types of promotions all the time. Well, one of the promotions was only supposed to be for a finite period of time, and it basically was millions of dollars of mistakes that cost the company a lot. We stood behind the person. That person still became successful and became a leader in the organization down the road. So, like you said, it's the standards and the empowerment and the trust that you're going to gain so much credibility with your employees for that way. Now, if people do that on a regular basis and you keep that up, then you'll lose credibility. But when you know that some of these people just make honest mistakes and they're a good performer, you have to roll with the punches there, and it's so crucial with that.
So questions that we've left you with after all of this.
You talked about the cross-functional sort of early stage. There's often friction. Can you talk to what do you do, if anything, to kind of manage that friction so people are able to be effective in cross-functional?
So the question is, at the early stage, cross-functional interactions, a lot of times there's friction between the different cross-functional leaders, so how do you deal with that, basically? I mean, you can go one of two ways. You can be more prescriptive. The companies I've been in, it's more let the leaders figure that out, because if the CEO is always going to be prescriptive about something, then that's not empowerment, right? Now, if people can't figure it out, then you have to step in and try to manage what's best for the business. But sometimes you want that push and pull. You want that friction, because maybe an idea should be challenged, or it comes up with a better idea out of that. Now, if it's constantly like that, and then there's distrust, and then there's political issues that come of it, you don't want that. But sometimes some of that friction is good. In the early days, I would say let that go, but it depends on the scale and the issues involved.
I agree. In the early phase, it is sell first, ask questions later. And as long as you're selling whatever it is that you're selling, whether it's users or product or services, if that's being supported, let the friction go in that stage.
So yes, and yes, because we are right now in between the C-series budget and the anxiety. So everything that you're talking about, like, oh my God, this is me, this is happening. So that's refreshing, because all of those pain points, absolutely feeling. The one thing I'd love to get your perspective on is you're talking about the co-founder loyalists. Yep, got those, working some of them out of the business. It has been painful. But even more so is pulling back the co-founders and saying your role is expanding now. So it's not just about how the rest of the team is growing, but telling them that you don't need to be down here in the weeds anymore. Like, get away, get out of my business. You have bigger things to do. So how have you dealt with some of that? And as the people leader, I suspect a lot of that's coming from you. So what are you
Okay, so real quick, the question is how to pull back the co-founders. And I think this is the story of Ron's life. So, Ron?
I mean, it's easier said than done, but no, absolutely. Again, because, especially co-founders that this is their first gig, and at Lyft, both of them, it was their first gig. And so when things get bigger, I remember a story, I'll give you a quick story. when I first joined, we were 80 people. We were in 2 offices, one in San Francisco, one in Oakland. We started to scale, and we said that we wanted to bring it together into a San Francisco location. So we became about 200 people. We had all hands events to say, here's a history, just kind of celebrate this as a pivotal moment. One of the co-founders came to me. He was hyperventilating. He goes, "Oh my God, we grew too fast. What are we doing? We don't know how to handle this." So you calm down. You have to just reinforce that. But as you scale, though, it's hard for them to grow, and they want to hone in on details because they can control the details, and they have to learn by their mistakes. So you have to see some of the repercussions until they get it, because their intuition is, I want to go deeper instead of going higher, and it takes a while. Some get there, some don't get there, but it's a constant battle that you're always coaching them on, and you always are coaching the other execs too. It can't just be me, it has to be the business as well too, because I can only talk about one side. So it's educating the entire executive team to do that. But it's never a point where, oh, he made it or she made it. It's always evolving, and it's tough. So I empathize.
I think diplomacy is so important. This is something that Ron does really well, is you have to play both sides. Because if you go up against the founders at this stage, you'll get fired. Or you'll lose all your credibility and be just this lame duck talent leader that's doing nothing with talent in the meantime. So what I've seen Ron do really effectively is make the founders aware that he's on their team and be supportive, but also make the people, who are usually the ones that are feeling the pain, your teams, understand that you feel their pain and that you're trying to address the most important parts of those pain a little bit at a time. So diplomacy is the biggest skill at that stage.
And you have to pick your battles. You can't change everything. You have to worry about the big things. The small things, you just have to let it go. And again, on your teams too, that's the big thing in their world. So you have to just really coach your team and say, yes, just let this go, but I'm telling you, this will help down the road. And when they're junior on your team, it's a tough lesson to learn, but that's the only way that you're going to scale and survive.
I have an article that I read recently that I love, and it was about consultants, but I think it applies to everybody. Your job should be 1/3 politics. We all kind of accept that. It needs to be managed. 1/3 of your kind of subject matter expertise and sort of bringing those credentials to the table, and 1/3 managing trade-offs. And if you're not spending at least 1/3 of your time, effectively working through important trade-off decisions that need to be made, you're probably not in an optimized role. Last question, I think, because we're done at 3, right? Yeah. Anybody know? Oh, good. Okay, we have plenty of time then. Next question, sorry.
Yeah, so currently we're at 1,800 employees. We've added about 1,300 in the last 3.5 years. We're now international, but I'm seeing talk about with our international offices specifically, they're having a different culture experience than what we have at HQ. Part of that is that we did not put that process in place of having, like, this is how you open up an office. You have a GM, this is the process. So we had passionate employees who went to those locations and opened up those offices. They're not the right leaders anymore. And so right now we're struggling with that as we continue to add on at least one new international office every year. What is the best process that you suggest at this point? We're in the middle stage to come in and start building those processes, because we are this big steam engine right now, and it is really hard to pivot.
So the question is that your company grew to 1,800 employees, also started to grow internationally, but the international offices that opened were, you didn't have a playbook of how to open them. I'm assuming that the leaders there were new to the company?
So it's different at each office.
Okay.
We do have a location manager. As our city office, we finally got a location manager there. But we don't have that in London. We don't have that in Toronto. It's like functional heads, not actually, so like they're actually the head of sales, but they're also functioning as a location leader, which doesn't quite translate.
Okay, so how to manage international growth during hypergrowth phase. I spent the first 15 years of my career in global talent management and global mobility, so I've seen this a lot firsthand. Nobody does it really well, and you always have this headquarters versus, especially when you get international and farther away. The best example I've seen is from a company who I'm not going to say the name because I have served them, who you will all know as one of the companies who has managed hypergrowth the best. what they did was instead of trying to take these kind of original kind of cultural representative people and have them open offices and then get stuck with them when they don't have the skills to manage an office, they made cultural teams that were and designed a whole department around, you are the team that is meant to build and develop and maintain our culture in these other countries. So what they did was examined, they went through the kind of DNA of the company. Who are we really? They looked at 19 variables that sort of describes where they are and different points of where they are in the evolution of how one can kind of profile a company. They took the most important ones and then they took those out to each office as a team and were responsible. They stayed for 1 year and they were responsible for sort of onboarding those offices. Now they had the luxury of money, so they could hire these teams, but if you can somehow replicate the process of not putting them in charge of the office, but making someone in charge of kind of cultural maintenance and only picking the 1, 2, 3 things that are most important, and then respect the differences of, we're not going to have the same food because your place is smaller and you have different food, or we're not going to have the same perks because it's illegal in this country. Gosh, I've seen that one over and over again. You have to clean that up on the back end. You did some international expansion, at least thinking at Lyft.
Yeah, no, we did. I mean, we were thinking of expanding internationally, and then we decided not to do it. It was probably the best thing to do at the time because we would have got obliterated from a money standpoint. But everything Heather says, I echo as well. I do think, though, it's important, though, to bring, even have like a rotating schedule of people from HQ go in and try to enter in, like, this is how you hire people. You don't have to be the leader for the organization, but this is how you hire people. This is what we look for, and this is the bar we have from a values alignment standpoint. But ultimately, when you become an office of more than 50, you should definitely have a leader in that office. You should also have an HR person in that office, and that HR person can also be a conduit to that as well. So that's what I would add.
So my company, just for background, I work for a group called Flipboard. We were about 25 people this time last year. Now we're 85 people, so we're definitely in a period of growth. The two things that are affecting now is so many meetings that we have no time to do our core jobs, which is now resulting in burnout, because when your day ends at 6, you're now working for several hours. So, but the goal is like alignment to have all these meetings. So how do you kind of balance for burnout as you're scaling, and then how any tools or tips for like building alignment without more meetings that you can share?
So to repeat the question, how do you manage to avoid burnout as things get busier and you're working the whole clock instead of just the work day, and tips and tricks for managing the need for more communications but having meeting overload?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem that almost every company has. I mean, at Facebook, when I was there, we implemented no meeting Wednesdays, so that is a thing where you could do your work and not get bogged down with meetings. The other thing I instituted at Lyft and also at Zume too is that if you have a meeting, you have to have an agenda for the meeting and who are the key people that need to be there. So some need to be informed, some need to actually be a decision maker or a participant. So really try to hone in on what's the meeting about and who should be there. And you'll probably eliminate a lot of meetings that way. But I think it's a balance too. I mean, a lot of times, depending, like in our roles too. I mean, there are so many things that come up in the day that you never even anticipated. It's still your responsibility to get through that. Is it meetings? Is it a fire you have to pull out? And ultimately, in our role, if you're like a head of a people organization, you are going to have to do things after hours. But again, that's why you have to be more vigorous about what types of meetings you go to.
I think as talent leaders, being mindful of the mental health and emotional health of your workforce, it needs to be of utmost importance, especially in this day and age where employees are expecting it. So burnout is the number one way to create a mental breakdown, and there's lots of companies that are still just letting that happen and then giving you time off when you have a mental breakdown. It's just not a sustainable model. The other point I'd circle back to is the don't fall in love point. Whatever meetings make sense today, don't be afraid to be like, hey guys, this one this is too often, or we're repeating this and this here and there. We can do this by email. And if you don't constantly manage that calendar, just as an individual, but also as a leader and a talent leader, you will. That's the number one way to create burnout. So manage your calendar, avoid burnout.
Yeah, and the other thing, one-on-ones are so important, and I want to always be present for my team. And I learned over the years, right? Obviously, with your directs, you have to have regular meetings, but you still want to be connected to your entire org. So what I do is office hours once a week, where it's from 2 to 3, and people can sign up for 15-minute blocks. You can sign up for 2, no more than 2. So you still feel connected to people. Otherwise, there's no way you can scale and have meetings with everyone. So that's a trick that I use too.
Sorry, you keep raising your hands.
No,
Yeah.
when it comes to people development, so around training and development, have you seen investments in particular topics or just kind of approaches that have really paid dividends before you get to that hockey stick growth? Whether you've done it yourselves or advised in particular ways people should be thinking about that when you have development teams coming in at earlier stages, say like 2, 3, 4.
So the question is about learning and development in the early stages, around 200 people and beyond, before the hockey stick growth. What have we seen and what have we done? Yeah, so a lot of these companies, especially in the early days, in the time or the number of people you're talking about, a lot of managers are new managers. They never been managers before. So the number one training is manager training, right? And so and obviously you don't have the resources to do it yourself. So the 2 companies that I've always outsourced to that have gotten very good results are Life Labs. People heard of Life Labs before? Based in New York, and then Everwise. And so what Everwise is a mentoring program for managers that they connect you with someone outside the organization to be kind of like a mentor for you for 6 months. And it was a very effective program because you're learning a lot of things. And then the Life Labs, it's all about how do you show up? How do you develop teams? How do you do conflict? And the key is not just having this once, it's that you then build upon it. So manager training is the most important thing to do at any stage when you're about to go through hypergrowth, because people stay and leave because of managers. So you have to give them the tools in order to have difficult conversations and partner with your business partner in order to get there. So that's the initial investment that I try to make. And then as you scale, then you also want to have individual training as well. And I like to use those companies like Udemy and others out there where you can have online trainings that you can put up there, or people can, take courses that they want to learn new skills in. I always think that you have to tailor the training to meet people where they're at. You can't just force training on them. So it's a good temperature on what the employees and the managers need, and then try to figure out from there.
The organizations who will win through hypergrowth and in this next phase of the existence of organizations will be the best learning organizations that get created. It's funny that you asked this question. It made me stop and think, because we were just talking about it is the most neglected area of HR, and it's the last thing that we get called in as consultants to help with. Like, really nobody's paying attention to it until it's way too late. So the way you asked your question, right before that hockey stick, what would you do? The number one thing I get called in for is, we're in the hockey stick phase now, I mean in L&D specifically, and we have all these trainings that have just proliferated everywhere. We don't even know what trainings are offered. We have no idea what experience everybody's having in their kind of employee experience journey. So can you just help us figure out what all is happening? And then most importantly, can you help us get it onto a centralized platform so that we can somehow kind of unify it, make sure that the core stuff is getting to everybody, and keep track of the other pieces. It's a really hard challenge to get everybody onto one learning platform. So it goes back to my original point in that seed swagger phase. If you can get your technology set up from the beginning, and you have that foresight to say, oh, L&D doesn't really matter right now, we're just drinking from the fire hose. If you start then, you're in a way better position. It is a terribly ugly project, and I'll tell you what else. We get called in to do that project a lot. It gets abandoned a lot because it then gets deprioritized, and they just let L&D stay in a kind of shit show, excuse my language, state for far too long.
Can I ask a follow-up question, just kind of building on the L&D thing? Can we rather kind of double-click a little bit? So you talked, let's pick manager training rather than talk about it kind of more abstractly. Like, what are the skills that employees need the most in order to handle this reality and that experience of hypergrowth?
Well, I think the biggest thing is difficult conversations. People avoid difficult conversations and performance conversations because in this day and age, a lot of millennials want to know what their career pathing is. And if a manager cannot articulate that with them, they lose their individual. So it's developing skills to have those tough conversations, and how not only have those career conversations, but how you give opportunities to individuals. So my personal philosophy is you want someone to come in, kill the role that they're in, and then start giving them new opportunities for that next role and see how they do that. So people really appreciate that you're giving them opportunities while they're still in their old role. So that's skills that are very important for managers. The other thing is time management. As you have, all these direct reports, you have your own goals and so forth. Managers don't know how to balance that. And then you talk about burnout. They're going to burn out, and then they don't treat people well, and all those things. So I'd say those are the top two things to focus on.
I love those answers. I would put definitely time management number one for me. I would add on maybe a little bit of it, add on to the first one is conflict resolution. And I know there was a session on that, I think today. I didn't get to go to it, but that's would create the most lasting and positive effect. We all have to deal with it. Very few people know how to deal with it, and especially young managers.
So when you're looking to grow internationally to new offices, how do you approach like understanding those different cultures? Because like when you go to a new country, there's different business culture than in North America. And how do you make sure that you're accounting for that and helping your employees navigate that culture?
So the question is, when you move into international countries, how do you understand and assess the culture and the ramifications there? I mean, the number one thing that we're doing, we just opened India just recently. We partnered with our legal team very closely because there's a lot of legal regulations and practices that we're just not aware of. Like we give equity, India doesn't give equity, so you have to have phantom equity and all these other things. So first you have to understand the rules and regulations. So people and legal need to partner. And then also you really need to understand the customs and some of the things that how people operate in those countries. And so it's imperative to actually go out there, someone from your team, to be kind of like the first person to understand those areas. And so what we did is we had a person here who is from India, wanted to go back on a rotational period to help understand what the customs are related to our world of manufacturing, and who were the right contacts. So really, I think you need to get either a consultant if you don't have someone internally to do it, but get someone who knows the business practices there and know how to scale the culture within that type of country. So otherwise, you're flying blind, and it's just going to be a pretty substantial disaster.
Yeah, I'll give you a little tip. Again, having grown up in mobility, I agree. Lawyers, definitely. Consultancies, they're going to want your business, and they'll do a cultural onboarding for you in each country. That will include all the bookkeeping regulations, the places where the lawyers leave off. And then call the household goods and the destination services providers that are going to want your business for anyone that you're going to move there. They have great cultural onboarding programs that are designed to onboard your employees. So they'll onboard you. They'll show you around town. They'll give you an idea of all the neighborhoods. They'll give you cultural deep dive. Take advantage of those companies that are going to want your business.
How do you think about org design for the people org, right? Going from 80 to 2,000, right? You sort of like, why is your G&A budget so high? Which is the first question. So how do you think about building the people who are going to help support through all of this?
Sure. The way that I think about it is hire, grow, keep. So hire is a TA side. So either have one leader overall of TA, or have one for business and one for technical, and then have managers underneath them. Then I always talk about the business partner org. I think that's very crucial. I don't want to have a leader between me and the business partner org, but you want to have leaders over the different functions. So you have to look at what's the big orgs in your organization. Like for me at Zume right now, it's manufacturing, it's the business side, and then it's technical. So have 3 directs there is what I usually do. And then I have something called Center of Excellence, and they are the program designers for everything that we need to implement. A lot of companies have the business partners do it. I want that separation. They have to partner and really the design, they talk about it, but really you have the Center of Excellence that really designs it. So I have a total rewards group for benefits and compensation. I have an analytics group that is HRIS, systems, and people analytics. Then you have a TLND that does talent development, learning and development programs, and then an experience organization that does onboarding and things like that. So that's how I structure it. Does that answer your question?
I would also add, back to those micro moves, don't wait for an org design initiative that, if you can micro redesign little pieces of function, even sub teams, go for it. It used to kill me as a consultant. I would be like, oh my God, we're doing this 10 times over. Why don't we do this like for everybody at the same time? You can't wait. It's never the right time for that until you reach that kind of maturity phase. So make the micro adjustments, see how it works, and keep redesigning if you need to.
And one other tip that I've learned across the board too, compensation is so critical to everything we do this day and age. Yes, there's a lot of comp consultants out there, no offense taken, but I would hire a comp person internally, probably between 300 and 400 employees, for sure. That's a tip that is very important. I think we ran out of question or ran out of time. So hopefully this was engaging for you. And if you have any other questions, you can come to Heather and I offline. But thanks for listening.
Thank you.